Hey, research students, today we're continuing our talks on American foreign policy, Cold War era, and today we're going to be focusing in on the 1960s. So when we look at Cold War tensions in the 1960s, it really starts in the late 50s, but John F. Kennedy is elected president in 1960, and at the time we've got tensions with Cuba. Cuba had become a communist country under the leadership of Fidel Castro right here, and Fidel Castro allied Cuba with the Soviets, and so this is Nikita Khrushchev. He is leader of the Soviet Union, and they become allies and begin working together. And as you know, the Soviet Union being the United States' arch enemy at this time during the Cold War, having an ally really close to the U.S., as Cuba is only about 90 miles off the coast of Florida, this is a problem for the United States. So in the late 50s, Dwight D. Eisenhower was still president because Kennedy doesn't become president until 1960. He authorized the creation of a training program for exiles of Cuba. So people that had been kicked out of Cuba. We're going to train these people in the U.S., we're going to send them back into Cuba to overthrow Castro and the Cuban Communist government. So this is our attempt to try to get rid of the communist government in Cuba. So before it was totally planned out and before it played out, President Kennedy becomes president, and he allowed the plan to continue. However, he did not agree with providing air support. He didn't want to link the United States with this invasion in case something went wrong or whatever. He didn't want the U.S. To take the blame. So the Cuban exiles are sent into Cuba. They enter the Bay of Pigs in the southern part of Cuba, and they're quickly defeated by the Cubans. It was an epic failure and very embarrassing foreign policy blunder for John F. Kennedy and the U.S. And so now the Cubans are on to the United States, that they were trying to overthrow their government, and it's a huge black eye for the U.S. government and an embarrassing failure. Other items of note during the 1960s, the Berlin Wall is constructed by Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union. The idea is to cut off eastern Berlin from West Berlin and Western Europe. People were trying to get into West Berlin because if they could get into West Berlin, they could get out of the communist areas of Eastern Europe. So Eastern Berlin became a strict area without any freedoms. The economy was not very good, just like the rest of Eastern Europe. Western Berlin was prosperous, had economic freedom, was very much like Western Europe. And so two parts of the same city developed totally differently throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s, just like the two parts of Europe, East and West, developed totally differently throughout the same time period. Okay, back to Cuba in 1962. So U.S. is sending spy planes over Cuba, and they discover that there are some missile sites with nuclear warheads in Cuba. And this is a huge problem for President Kennedy because, like we said earlier, Cuba is very close to the United States, and a missile from Cuba could easily hit most portions of the U.S. So in order to try to solve this issue, Kennedy announced a naval blockade. So that means we're going to surround Cuba with our Navy. We're not going to allow anything in or out. And he threatened to invade Cuba if the missiles were not withdrawn. So obviously the Soviet Union, being allies with Cuba, prepares to defend Cuba, and so tensions are very highly raised. And this is what's called the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's the closest we've ever come to an actual nuclear war. There are some open communications between the U.S. and the Soviet Union publicly, and then there's also some private communications going on. And ultimately, the U.S. and the Soviets came to an agreement with the Soviets. They agreed to withdraw their missiles from Cuba as long as the U.S. would not invade Cuba and the U.S. agreed to pull its missiles out of Turkey, which was close to the Soviet Union. And that's kind of how the Cuban Missile Crisis ended up being solved. But we were very close there for a few days of having a nuclear crisis.